And a very big welcome from me. I'm Alex, founder of Neurotopia CIC, and I'm going to be kicking off this Links Lives Natters collaborative podcast with a somewhat lesser discussed and potentially controversial topic. We're in October now, the nights are drawing in, the pumpkins are out in full force, it's Halloween, my favourite time of year, and I think it's a good time to delve into the dark side of my favourite subject, which is of course neurodivergence. Now, I'm going to start with a trigger warning because of today's subject matter. Today we will be discussing the prison system, exploring trauma, suicide, and the variety of difficulties experienced by some of our neurodivergent community. It's a heavy-hitting subject matter and not for the faint-hearted. So now you've all been suitably warned. I am very excited to be joined today by my favourite person, who repeatedly got into trouble at school for whispering the answers to me in maths class, my lifelong friend and neurodivergent, diversely qualified practitioner unicorn, Kate Alexander. It's great to have you here, Kate. How are you?
Hi, Alex. I'm really well, thank you. I'm extremely excited to be here. I'm a little nervous, but because this is quite a heavy and personal subject matter.
Well, don't worry, Kate, you're in good hands, and this is our first podcast, so hopefully our listeners won't judge us too harshly. For the benefit of those listening, Kate, tell me about you. Who are you, your history as regards our topic, and what you do?
About me, well, I've recently made neurodivergence my specialist interest as I've become increasingly aware of how it affects my own life and my family. I'm currently on an endless waiting list for my own assessment of ADHD, and this came about after I attended a webinar which I'd hoped would help me to understand and support my children and their relationship with school. And I was basically looking for help to navigate the complex systems of school, the council and health in order to access the best support for them. And we might delve into that a little bit later. But what I learned in that webinar was about my own way of being and how that's aligned with neurodivergence. A bit more about me. I'm a registered mental health nurse and psychotherapist. I worked for the NHS for 15 years. My nursing began in the prison service, which inspired me to do a master's in forensic psychology because I always want to know more about how people think and to understand what motivates them, how we work, and from a therapeutic perspective, how to help people understand themselves and should they choose to make positive and meaningful change. After my little stint in the prison, I moved into community nursing, and from there into the psychology and psychotherapy service, where it was where I completed my training to become a psychotherapist. We specialised in treating complex trauma and delivering trauma-informed approaches throughout the mental health teams. I worked for an addiction recovery charity treating trauma as well, but now I work for myself a couple of days a week, offering therapy privately, and for the rest of the time I take care of my family.
Wow, that's a lot of experience and a great set of skills, Kate. This is why I've got Kate on the show. Interestingly, both myself and Kate used to work at a local prison, but in different roles and during different time periods. I've read recently that it's estimated that 50% of the prison population is neurodivergent, and that's across the whole spectrum, so not just autism and ADHD, but potentially personality disorders, PTSD, dyslexia, and so on. Personally, I think it could be much more. What's your take on that, Kate?
Well, let's break this down a little bit. We're using the term neurodivergence to describe neurological differences from the norm, whilst also recognising that everyone's brains are individual. Some neurological differences are present from birth, also known as neurodevelopmental differences, and some neurological differences are acquired and shaped through environmental, medical and life experiences. So when you refer to high levels of neurodivergence within the prison population, a couple of things are important to bear in mind. The first thing is pinning down what neurological conditions are covered by that umbrella term, because there isn't a universally accepted definition of who and what counts when it comes to neurodivergence. And there are differences of opinion about what fits and what doesn't. The other things to bear in mind are how these assessments are made and by whom, and whether people feel competent to make those judgments. Formal diagnoses require extensive tests, clinical interviews, history gathering, observations, multidisciplinary liaison, and so forth, and it can be a difficult to access and lengthy process. However, self-reporting has some validity, especially when people are informed. Identification of neurodivergence by health and education providers is also really informative. However, until recently, it wasn't something that professionals in prisons were routinely screening for. So the white paper that came out was commissioned to research neurodiversity within the criminal justice system, and they narrowed the term neurodivergence down predominantly to neurological developmental disorders, which is neurodiversity, which is present from birth, which incorporates learning difficulties and disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, tic disorders, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and they also included people with cognitive differences caused by acquired head injury, which is a neurodivergence caused by environmental experiences. However, they did not extend their definition of neurodivergence to psychological trauma or to personality disorders or to OCD. If those difficulties are included in their definition of neurodivergence, I do believe the figures will be significantly higher than 50%.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Kate. I think it would be much higher. I mean, personally, I'd even go as far as 99%, but that's just me personally. Why is this happening? So many neurodivergents in prison?
That's a really interesting and complex question, and there are people a million times more qualified than me who might struggle to handle the enormity of that issue. It should be uncontroversial to begin by stating that no one should be isolated, stigmatised, excluded, or even criminalised for being different. However, while it's under-researched, it's widely accepted that neurodivergent children are disproportionately excluded from schools and are overrepresented in the youth justice system. Trauma and neurodivergence tragically come hand in hand. Not only is the nervous system of a neurodivergent person more likely to be exposed to trauma, would be more susceptible to being traumatised, but the neurodivergent person is also more likely to be exposed to trauma, exacerbating both difficulties with neurodivergence and symptoms of trauma. So recent research suggests that 80% of adults with ADHD report experiences of trauma and abuse, and people with autism are significantly more likely to be exposed to trauma than their neurotypical counterparts. So the majority of neurodivergent children facing bullying at school, these are all examples of adversity that are commonly faced by our neurodivergent community. And this is just me focusing on childhood here. So some disturbing statistics to share with you. 80% of children who have been sentenced or cautioned for an offence were recorded as having special educational needs. Of young people in custody, it's estimated 12% have ADHD, 15% are autistic, and 60 to 90% have some form of speech, language and communication difficulty. Autistic children are 3 times more likely to get suspended from school, and children with ADHD are 100 times more likely to be excluded from school. So this brings me to the inescapable conclusion that there is something inherent within our education, social and justice systems that punish differences. And this can result in pervasive loneliness and shame in being neurodivergent, because neurodivergent children and adults are expected to operate in a neurotypical world where they've come to learn to varying extents that their interactions, reactions and characteristics are not typical and are therefore problematic. So I would suggest that there are chronic system failures that fail to respond to neurodiversity sensitively, appropriately and in a timely fashion. Accessing support's really difficult at every level as well. So whether the barriers are around lengthy waiting lists or impenetrable bureaucratic processes or lack of resources and funding in a local area, the lack of continuity with professionals who you have to start over and over again with, it just leads to people being deprived of assessments, treatments, financial support, sometimes adequate housing, employment opportunities. And these deficits and struggles can lead to adverse life experiences, poor mental health, poor physical health, disengagement or exclusion from education and employment. So attempting to cope with this kind of adversity can result in the development of some really risky survival strategies and lifestyles. I'm thinking about the role of self-medicating with illegal or unprescribed substances, and the development and maintenance of addiction. I mean, it's been reported that self-medication is helpful to mask symptoms of neurodivergence, and it can manage symptoms for some people of anxiety or low mood, especially in the short term. And it also might help people to deal with trauma, but obviously there are significant life implications for people who use substances long term. There's also more research which talks about whether using illicit substances is sensation seeking or whatever, but whatever the reason, there are strong connections between neurodivergence and addiction to drugs and alcohol, and potentially engaging in antisocial behaviour.
Yeah, so you've identified quite a few additional risk factors there for neurodivergence. Is there any more potential risk factors that you can think of for that?
The National Autistic Society's Youth Justice Report identifies possible risk factors associated for autistic young people, and their involvement in the criminal justice system. So these people might be more easily led by others, or have more complicated relationships, and socialisation skills might be tricky here. Difficulties in understanding personal boundaries. These characteristics don't mean that autistic children are inherently difficult, nor do they mean that somehow neurodivergent children are more likely to commit a crime. Instead, what it means is that neurodivergent children need additional support and safeguarding, because they may be vulnerable to misunderstanding certain situations, as well as themselves being misunderstood or isolated or exploited.
Yeah, of course it's important to note that every neurodivergent person is completely different to one another, regardless of diagnosis. I remember when I met my first autistic person with ADHD several years ago, and I was thinking, I wonder if we'll be quite similar because of having similar neurotypes. But realistically, no, we were very different, and that was the beginning of a lot of eye-opening for me in community. Kate, what do you think we could do in society or community to help prevent offending behaviours and perhaps support neurodivergence that might be at risk?
I feel like the earlier that people's needs are identified and supported, the better the long-term outcomes will be. In theory, childcare and education settings, together with GP surgeries and families, have a shared and ongoing dialogue that assesses educational, emotional and physical development. And any differences can be explored and supported. However, in reality, these institutions or these systems can clash with each other in really unhelpful ways, which in my experience can result in circling around difficulties with no clear plans or sensible pathway to address what might be needed. Each service seems to be relying on the other to blink first before taking ownership of a child's journey, and helping families to navigate and identify their own needs in the processes. So, yeah, my experience of the process has been quite punishing, and it often has resulted in referrals for help either being lost in waiting lists or being rejected because the needs of the local population are overwhelming, or there's not an available provision. So early identification is really important, but so too is early support and understanding, and a clear pathway forwards. I have actually got an example of a time it's an anecdotal piece of information. A friend of mine has a daughter who was anxious while she was at school. The symptoms of anxiety led to urinary urgency. She wasn't allowed to go to the toilet during lessons. She was incredibly uncomfortable, wasn't able to do any learning in that space, and she had a small accident and experienced some sort of significant shame and anxiety, which worsened her anxiety around being in school and needing to use the toilet. And the family was informed and contacted the school, and they were informed that only with a doctor's note would they be able to allocate a toilet pass for the child. And I just find this baffling. Like, I don't understand why we need to why we can't make sensible, compassionate, reasonable decisions to take care of each other instead of it feels like an unnecessary use of a doctor's time to be writing a toilet pass, or to be medicalising something that that could be solved and resolved really easily at school. And I've seen a few of those sorts of complaints as well on Mumsnet, saying, oh, you know, my child needed to get a toilet pass from the doctor, or a medical reason to have a toilet pass, and it costs £30, you know. And I think, again, why are we doing this? You know, it doesn't seem to make sense.
At the Thrive Tribe, we believe everyone deserves the chance to soar. Whether you're an individual seeking self-improvement or a business aiming for success, we've got you covered. Personalised coaching. Unlock your potential with our expert coaches. One-on-one guidance tailored to your unique goals. Learn flexibly online. Boost your skills from Microsoft Office mastery to work-based expertise. Lifelong learning? We've got the keys. So whether you're an aspiring professional, a business leader, or simply hungry for growth, join the Thrive Tribe today. Visit thethrivetribe.com and let's ignite your journey. Remember, it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. The Thrive Tribe, where potential meets possibility.
Hey there, Lincolnshire business owners. Struggling to be found online? Still buried on page 3 of Google? Wondering if anyone's even looking? Well, stop stressing and join the Lincolnshire Business Directory. It's completely free to join, and you'll finally start getting noticed. Think of it like shouting from the hilltops, but digitally. Want to really make a splash? For just £99, you can upgrade to a premium listing and get in front of more eyes. You'll be the talk of the town. It's super easy. Pick a plan, create your listing, and boom, you're live. Customers will be finding you faster than you can say SEO. Head to www.lincolnshirebusinessdirectory.co.uk. Don't miss out. Your customers are waiting.
So I think that's why I started Neurotopia CIC in the first place, is because it was very clear that there is a deficit in neurodivergent support that's specifically tailored for neurodivergence. And by that I mean a completely neuro-inclusive kind of premise. And so what I think we need is more community, more engagement with peers, peer-designed frameworks for inclusivity. That's something I'm working on. You know, adaptations, accommodations. These are all things that can benefit all of us, and not just neurodivergence. But if we put that in place now, I do believe that we can, you know, change the track that we're going down for future generations. So yeah, thank you for that, Kate. You made some really good points there. We both clearly have an interest in forensic psychology, which is a bit of a dark subject in itself. But then we were chatting recently about what the dark side of neurodivergence really is. Can you tell our listeners about that, Kate?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, a dark side of neurodiversity is seen in just how difficult it is to access support that is so badly needed. And it seems perverse that the very skills you need to access and request and gain the support you need are the very skills you might be deficient in. I'm thinking about form filling in and attending appointments and submitting lots of evidence and following up, and, you know, it could be navigating technology with multiple passwords and, you know, two-factor authentication, and some of these things are actually in and of themselves really, really tricky for people. And some people don't have those resources, either the physical resources or the cognitive capacity, and these things don't make sense. If people haven't been accessing education or been able to access it, then things can be really, really challenging. And I was thinking about an analogy for this from a kind of physical health perspective. And it's kind of like saying to somebody who requires like a walking aid, you know, a wheelchair or something, yes, you can have a wheelchair that you really need to be mobile with. It's at the top of that block of flats. And so you have to go and get it and bring it down and it's yours. And that's free, you know. And then it's like, oh, okay, but there is an elevator and it costs £2,000 if you want to get there quickly. And when I'm thinking about the elevator for somebody with neurodivergence, that might be, I'm going to pay for my own assessment, or I'm going to pay for my child's assessment so that we can get the treatment, have the assessment and get the treatment, and we can do this within, you know, not 7 years or something. It can happen because there are numbers like that around the country. I heard it on the news in Leeds. There's a 10-year wait for an ADHD assessment, and that's equivalent to saying there is no service at all available for you. So then you get on the lift, you pay the money, and even then there are boundaries and there are hurdles to actually getting to the treatment that you need, because actually the medication isn't available in the pharmacy, or actually that's another £50, and it's another £50 that you have to pay before you can retrieve it. And so you get on the lift and you still don't quite get to what you need. And then if you finally do that, and you've achieved it, and you've made the appointments and you've attended them, and everybody's been out of school or out of work to make sure they've attended those appointments, and you're kind of getting off the lift at the end with the prescription in your hand, there's a sense of like people like, oh, so you paid for it, did you? Oh, you paid for that treatment, you skipped the queue. And then there's another sense of potentially shame, or however people handle that, you know. So it's not an easy ride for people who, you know, whether or not they can they can fund their own assessments and treatments, is still not an easy ride. So I think that's a dark side of neurodiversity, there doesn't feel like there's enough support to access the support even sometimes. But yeah, trying to think of the dark sides of neurodiversity, and I think it's about the discourse as well, about people who need services, and all of these people with neurodivergence are coming out of the woodwork, and there's an epidemic of like assessments required. All of a sudden, everybody has it, and there doesn't seem to be much recognition of the fact that people have made it to adulthood and with lifelong struggles, and potentially lots of feelings of inadequacy, or not being good enough, or being very different and otherly, and they may have been bullied, they may have been abused, they may be experiencing trauma as well, and never really being able to make sense of their experiences. And so, you know, when I'm talking about the discourse, I'm thinking actually all of these inconvenient people who are making these huge waiting lists, and who want these accommodations at work, and they get to go out for their quiet time, or they have flexible working hours because they don't sleep and they don't wake up or whatever, you know. There's a sort of a very neurotypical lens that work environments, studying environments are viewed through. And so if you're unable to meet those demands, it's like a kind of inconvenient, you're costing us money and time and effort, and we just think you need to work harder, you know, you're being lazy, and that's the problem. So yeah, I think that's another dark side. It's kind of day-to-day difficulties that people experience it, and inequalities that they experience as a result of their neurodivergence, I think. So yeah, that's what I think the real dark side of neurodivergence is. And when I think about people being in prison, I think about those people who could have been supported better if only we had known, or if they had been assessed, and now we do, and now we have this opportunity to go, actually we can assess these people, we can understand what's going on. Neurodiversity is part of our community. I feel like the prison is the place where people have been thrown away, and that's where they've ended up. And I wonder if they all needed to be there, you know.
Yeah, it's really sad, and it makes me think about what you said, the marked inequalities that neurodivergent people face, and it makes me wonder how much of that, we can put down to the inequalities as to why they've ended up, in difficult positions, such as being in prison. But there clearly is a dark side and a dark element that's lesser talked about. And something else that I wanted to discuss, I read that a combined study by Nottingham University and Cambridge University revealed that 66% of autistic adults had experienced thoughts of suicide, and 35% had attempted suicide. So not only that, but they did a study that also revealed that undiagnosed autistics are at a significantly increased risk of suicide. These statistics are really concerning, aren't they?
They are really concerning, and that truly is another dark side of neurodivergence, and it being unmanaged and misunderstood. And yeah, those are some scary statistics as well.
Yeah, very scary. There's an important message in everything you've said today, and you told me recently about a conversation that you'd had with a fellow professional. I think the listeners would really like to hear this. Can you tell us about that, Kate?
Yeah, I was in an ambulance. I wasn't the patient. I was being transported, and got into conversation with the paramedic, and he was asking me what I do, and I said I was a mental health nurse, and he said, we have a lot of mental health patients, and I think we need extra training to be able to know what to do or how to be compassionate. I can't remember his words exactly, but we could do with some more training and more expertise in this area. Often it's confusing. People might be aggressive, and I don't know what to do. And I was sort of thinking, and I was thinking there and then, what could I impart that might be really helpful? And I was kind of trying to dig deep and get to the crux of what would be useful. And it really felt like, actually, it's really very simple. If somebody is expressing high levels of distress, and maybe they have their mind altered by substances or by mental illness or by huge levels of distress, I can see how that might be very frightening, and it may have its risks. Actually, I don't want to pretend there are no risks associated with that, but the very simple thing that you can do if you're the bystander in that position or the helper in that position is simply to be kind. Like, it's very, very basic, and I think it's because as an observer we can get very frightened by that high expressed emotion, and maybe there's movement and it feels unpredictable and risky. But actually just taking an interest, just trying to connect with the human who is behind or experiencing that distress, it can be very, very simple. And even simply being alongside somebody and being like, I'll be here with you, or asking the question, can I call anybody for you? What's going on for you? Validating their experience, it's really happening. Often I think when people experience compassion fatigue, they can feel even angered by somebody else's distress. Be like, they're feeling like this, they're saying these words and they're really distressing to me. And actually, I think that's another important thing to touch base with yourself about, like remembering, why did you do this kind of work? Why did you come into here? Because I can imagine a whole bunch of mental health nurses being interviewed, like, why do you want to be a mental health nurse? And I imagine every single one of them sat down and said, because I want to help people. And sometimes the reality is that sometimes you can't do anything to help or to fix, but simply being alongside and being present and tuning back into what can I do, and having a kind of open curiosity and like a desire to help, that can even be enough. So yeah, just being kind. And it was something that was in the white paper as well, when they were doing the neurodiversity awareness training. Some of the very basic skills that they were trying to align everybody with was actually just being curious about what people's needs are, and asking the question and maybe slowing down, maybe using more simplistic language, because when people are stressed, they can't think straight, and so using simplistic language, having accessible big signs, if that's what helps people, having things in familiar places, asking if taking them around like the trail that they're going to use or the routes they're going to use, introducing them to this is the canteen, this is where this is. If you've got any questions, I'm your named person, just making it familiar and putting people at ease can be quite easy as well. There's not big work. So yeah, kindness.
That's lovely. I think that's so important, because we forget these days that we're all human beings. You talked about compassion fatigue, and I think a lot of professionals, are going to be struggling with that because their exposure to these issues is so vast. But it is an important message that we all need to remember. We're all people, and we all struggle from time to time. Have you got anything to add, Kate, before we wind up today?
I just want to say, like I've just said, actually, it's very simple, be kind. And in some ways it really is that simple. But I also want to acknowledge that understanding neurodiversity, it is really complex. And I'd like to think that most people will have some awareness of conditions which are considered to be part of the neurodiversity umbrella, like ADHD and autism and others that we've already mentioned. However, a very small proportion of people will have a sufficient understanding of how these conditions can actually present outside of the well-publicised stereotypes. And this is made more complicated by the fact that it's common for individuals to have more than one neurodevelopmental difference to greater or lesser degrees of severity. And ultimately, the experiences and traits of neurodivergent individuals is highly variable. And not all individuals with autism are bad communicators. Not all individuals with ADHD spend hours hyperfocusing. Not all people with OCD are obsessively clean. So, actually having a genuine and effective understanding of neurodiversity means understanding the nuance of each specific neurodevelopmental condition and how these could present and interact with each other. And so, yes, awareness is probably the first step, but then the next step is to be aware of some more complicating factors, I think that will help with identifying people who might have neurodivergence, even if they don't know themselves. So yeah, the complexity of understanding neurodiversity it should not be oversimplified, because it is a lack of understanding which has likely led to the over-criminalisation and disproportionate exclusion of neurodivergent children and ultimately adults.
Yeah, it's such an important point to make. Understanding and education when it comes to neurodivergence. I just want to add, I think it's really important that we learn from neurodivergent people themselves. I think over the years it's very clear that people have perhaps learnt by neurotypical methods from neurotypical people, and it's probably resulted in so many people going undiagnosed. And so let's consult neurodivergent peers on training and educating to move forward. I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Kate. This has been absolutely fascinating and quite emotional, actually, chatting through so many things with you today. I have an Eventbrite workshop coming up next month on the dark side of neurodivergence. Please keep your eyes peeled for that one. Please follow Neurotopia CIC Facebook page and the Links Lives Natters Facebook page if you haven't already. A huge thank you to Shelley and Mark and Dom, the technical team behind the podcast, and here's to many more. And a huge thanks to all of you listening. Let's keep talking and listening on this important subject.